Matthew Carrington had decided to go through a hazing ritual, but he was told it would be innocent. No drinking, no drugs, no beatings. It was the peak of Hell Week, the final week before he was to be accepted as a full member of a fraternity. The hazing ritual took place in a dark, freezing cold basement. The temperature was in the 30s, and scrawled over the door was a saying, "In the basement, no one can hear you scream." That night, they were told to strip down to their underwear, soak themselves with water, and stand on a bench while other members questioned them about their fraternity. Matt stood on that bench for hours, holding up heavy water jugs and drinking more and more water while fans blasted their wet, freezing bodies. They were ordered to drop to a sewage-covered floor and do push-ups. In that dark, cold, wet basement, Matthew collapsed. He was unable to be revived, and his fraternity brothers panicked. An hour went by before anyone called 911. Matthew was dying. The coroner found no drugs, no alcohol, and ruled out physical abuse. Matthew's cause of death was water intoxication. He was made to drink 25 gallons of water. His blood was washed out, and his organs were bloated with fluid. Matthew's death wasn't an accident. First of all, let me say I'm sorry about your son. I can't imagine something like that. What happened?
He was actually tortured the last 3 days of his life, which a lot of people don't realize. They think that it all just started and ended on that one day.
So you hear this story and you talk about 5 big jugs of water. It's almost even hard to imagine that anybody could even put that much water inside yourself. How did you find out what happened to your son?
Our friend called and he said that Matt was in trouble. He was in the hospital. They didn't know how serious it was, but we needed to find him. And so I called the hospital and they said, "You're Matt Carrington's mother?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Hold on." And I thought, oh gosh. So then they transferred me to a nurse that transferred me to the doctor. And he said, "Well, Matt was brought in. He was under full arrest. You need to get to the hospital as soon as you can." At that point, I pretty much knew that it was really, really serious.
So I take it when you got to the hospital?
Well, what happened was my husband was in the city working, and so he needed to get home, and a social worker started calling me, at which point I knew that something wasn't right. And she said, "Debbie, you just need to get here as soon as possible." So we started on the trip. It was a 3-hour drive. Halfway through the trip, she kept calling to see where we were, and I said, "Listen, I know it's bad, and I just need to know if we're going to get there in time." And she said the words you don't ever. She said, "Debbie, we don't like to say this over the phone," at which time my heart sunk. And she said, "I'm sorry. Matt didn't make it." And the phone slipped somewhere, and my husband could tell that it was bad. And the scream that is inside of you that you don't know that you even exist comes from your body when you hear something like this. And so he pulled off, and we got out, and we held each other as a family. And that was the second that we knew that we weren't the family that we were, because our family hugs were always a family hug of 4.
I know this is difficult, but I think it's important that you walk us through what happened over those 3 days.
They'd taken him and they forced him to go down into the basement. The sewage had backed up in the basement, so there were feces and urine and cigarette butts and beer and vomit and everything down there. And they're forcing them to work out down there in this sewage water. And once they're done screaming, calling them names, forcing them to do different crazy things that, they're exhausted, they haven't slept in days. Then they make them stay in that basement where it's under 40 degrees and sleep in cubby holes that are like little dungeon holes. After the third day was the day that Matt was killed. And this was, in this instant, they have what they call movie night. They have him stand on a bench with one foot up. They're looking at a shoe in the ceiling. They're not allowed to speak unless they're spoken to. They're forced to pass this 5-gallon jug back and forth between each other and drink as much as they can each time they have it and answer these questions that are about the history of the fraternity, which this is something that's done a lot. This wasn't something they just made up. It happens in a lot of fraternities. And if you get it wrong, then you have to get off the bench and you have to do whatever it is they want you to do. All you're allowed to eat are onions and garlic. By this time it was like 3:45, 4 o'clock in the morning. Matt went down after, they were vomiting, they were urinating on themselves, they were half dressed, they were on this bench with these fans blowing the cold air from the outside in on them while they were dousing themselves in water and drinking this water. And he went down during push-ups, had a seizure, and eyes rolled back in his head, at which time somebody should have called 911. So an hour later, Matt stopped breathing, and at this point, when they're trying to resuscitate him, when you drink too much water, it swells your brain, it stops, your kidneys and your liver fail. It does, there's a little valve that goes to your lung that kind of ruptures. His brain swelled until it went to till it went to his skull, and foam started coming out of him, and he drowned from the inside out. But it was like his brain exploded. And they allowed this to happen because no one would take a stand and make that phone call because they were afraid.
So what happened to the fraternity and the men that did this to your son?
They ended up, 7 of them ended up serving time. We were actually quite fortunate because in California there is a flawed hazing law, and with persistence we got the very first felony conviction in hazing in the United States.
Okay, this might sound like a stupid question coming from me, but what would you say to young men and women who wants to join an organization like this?
Don't let anybody make you feel like you're less than what you are. Don't do anything you feel uncomfortable about. Don't be afraid to say no. And most importantly, when you're in a group and you know something is wrong, don't be afraid to say stop.
Well, like I said, hopefully by you coming on and sharing your story, maybe you stop a tragedy from happening to somebody else's kid.
I honestly hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Really do.
I was raped!
My name is Steve Wilkos, and I'm an investigative talk show host with a law enforcement background.
It was my life or his.
My job is to get truth and justice for everyday people. Watch our videos now.